Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. The peacemaking committee has been working on this for a long time. It got delayed a couple times because of COVID, and so we're glad that Brian could be among us today. Many of you may know that Jean and I got to know Brian a couple of churches ago. Before we were in Iowa, which is before we came here, we were in St. Joe, Missouri, and Brian still lives in the Kansas City area, so he was in the Presbyterian where we were at. And we were in a small group of pastors also for a while. And the thing I remember most about Brian from those days is he used to have a desk in his office that had a mound of paper from one end to the other, and he claimed it was very organized. So I don't know what your desk looks like now, Brian.
Very, very similar.
Very similar.
I still know where everything is.
But Brian is a pretty organized person. He's also the stated clerk of that presbytery currently, temporarily, I understand. He's worked in various functions for the General Assembly, at those events. But currently, and for how many years have you been with the Covenant Network?
9 years.
9 years. Wow. He's the executive director of Covenant Network, and this church, I don't even know how long this church has been part of the Covenant Network, but before, a long time before we came. Anybody have an idea?
Jim would know.
20 years?
Yeah. Almost since the beginning, I believe.
Yeah.
Nice. So this is not a new thing for us, but it's exciting for us to touch base with Covenant Network. We got to talk to Brian a little bit last night to kind of get updates of what's going on with that organization. I'm sure he'll be able to share some of that with what's going on with the good work of that organization, but also to help get a conversation going here. So we are glad to have you here, Brian. And Brian is going to talk for a while, and then we're going to have some conversation.
Thank you so much, Bob. Thank you, Bob, very much. It is really a pleasure to be with you all. And gosh, if I'd known it was going to be storytelling time, I would have come with a whole lot of other things you should know about Bob and Jean from Kansas City. I have very fond memories of those years. That was my first call as a pastor. And so being in a small group of thoughtful, creative, wise pastors, which Bob and Jean certainly were, and we had some other good friends in that group who were as well, was a great gift to me. It is a gift to be here as well. As Bob said, you've been part of the Covenant Network of Presbyterians for a long time, longer than I have. It was founded in 1997 to begin the work of helping the church talk about its policies of inclusion, and I'll talk a little more about both that history and what we're doing today, but know that you've been a part of that, and you've been helping make that possible with your prayers and with your financial contributions, and also with your faithful witness in your community. It's all made a difference, and I'm grateful. I want to say another word of introduction about myself, just to sort of offer you a little bit of context about why I'm doing this work, and then we'll talk a little bit about the work that the Covenant Network is doing and the work that we all are called to be doing with regard to welcome. The church that where the aforementioned desk was my first call. I served there for 13 years as their pastor, but almost all of those years I was serving in the closet. I was late in my life that I came to accept for myself that I was actually a gay man. In fact, it was while I was in seminary that I really accepted it. But by that point, I was in seminary in 1996 when the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church adopted a provision that prohibited the ordination of LGBTQ people. I was in seminary at the time, feeling deeply called to ministry, and I managed to convince myself that that was a part of my life that I would simply overlook and put away, and I wasn't in a relationship, and so I figured I would just go ahead and serve as a pastor. And that worked for a a few months. But, of course, whenever you ask a person to deny part of who they are, when you ask them to suppress something that's integral to their identity, and when you ask them to step away from the things that will give them life and companionship and love, it isn't a reasonable ask. And in time, I came to have to wrestle with what it meant for me to be in the ministry from which I was prohibited, while also being gay. I ended up in a relationship in 2003 with my now partner of 18 years. And so during all of those years, when I continued to serve the church, I struggled with the question, what's the right thing for me to do here? Church is growing. Ministry is happening. Is the right thing for me to do to walk away from all of that? It didn't feel faithful to my call to ministry. Is the right thing to do to sort of come out of the closet and tell the church, here's the story, and cause a lot of conflict? It wasn't part of what they asked for. The church would have had a wide range of views on that issue. I felt like I couldn't do that to them. Was the right thing to do to leave my relationship and deny who I was? That didn't seem faithful either. And so for 9 long years, I lived with that tension in that congregation. Not talking about my relationship, trying to be as faithful a minister as I could. Now, I'm not sure I made all the right choices during that time, to be honest. But I do know that I was making them for what I thought were the right reasons. And I was being forced to make them by a system that demanded people not be authentic. They either had to be inauthentic about their identity or inauthentic to the calling that God had put on their lives. That, to this day, even after the church has changed its policies, even after there are many ministers who are able to serve openly around the country, is still a challenge facing our church, and not just ministers, but our members as well. Anytime LGBTQIA+ people are put in a position to wonder whether they are safe, to wonder if they should share something about themselves, to wonder if they could go in that church door and truly be welcome, or if it won't really be a safe space. Anytime that happens, the church is still failing to be truly and fully the Church of Jesus Christ. Anytime a person is faced with the question of whether to be fully, authentically who they are. And so that's what motivates me to do this work. It's why for 9 years I've been executive director of the Covenant Network of Presbyterians, and it's why I'm here today. Let's go to the next slide. I want to start today by talking about this word welcome. Are we a welcoming church? And we'll probably keep talking about that during the panel discussion, because there's a certain degree to which the word welcome doesn't seem adequate. Everyone's welcome. We write the word welcome on a mat that we wipe our feet on. The church that I served in Parkville, Missouri, had a big banner over the door. Maybe Gene and Bob remember this. It said, "All are welcome." And I believe it was true. I mean, it was a very welcoming congregation. They would certainly, every person in that church would have defined themselves as part of a welcoming church. But LGBTQIA+ people, when they see a banner that says, "All are welcome," aren't really sure they believe it. Too many churches have told queer people that they're welcome and had it not actually be true. We need a little more. So the Presbyterian Church, we'll go to the next slide, is a case study in how churches sometimes get to the place of becoming more welcoming. The question I'm going to ask at the end of this, though, and I'll have our panel talk about it, is how welcoming are we? How safe a space, how bold a vision are we putting forward? Some of you know this history. If you've been part of the Covenant Network all this time, you've lived some of this history. The Presbyterian Church since the 1970s had a position, they called it definitive guidance, that said, quote, "self-avowed, unrepentant, practicing homosexuals could not be ordained." And that was the church's policy through the period when the northern and southern churches were united into one, through the 80s, through the 90s. That was the church's policy. Along the way, it also adopted a definition of marriage that said marriage is a civil contract between a man and a woman. That was, of course, accurate from a legal standpoint. There were no states that had same-sex marriage in the 1980s. But because we put that in our book of order, it became the tool that prohibited ministers from officiating same-sex marriages, even when the national policy, or policy state by state, was starting to change. It also kept churches from hosting same-sex marriages, even if they wanted to, in their sanctuaries. So all this built up to that moment that I mentioned in 1996, when the General Assembly adopted a new policy. It was ratified by the Presbyterians in 1997, that required, among the requirements for ordination, fidelity in marriage or chastity in singleness. And it was not only the fact that that actually became the policy of the church, but the kind of debate that the church had to get there. It was brutal. It was ugly. LGBTQ people and the people who supported them sat in national gatherings of the church and listened to them talked about, listened to themselves talked about in ways that were hurtful, in ways that misrepresented who they were, in ways that didn't reflect the love of Christ. And these were the images that lingered. These were the sounds ringing in the ears of the queer community in the Presbyterian Church for decades. If you go to the next slide, you can see that the General Assembly proceeded to keep reconsidering that policy. And in fact, the Assembly did vote several times to undo it. But the majority of Presbyterians around the country would have had to approve, and they didn't. So it stayed on the books. But they got a little closer each time. The Covenant Network was a big part of that process. We organized conferences and books and Presbyterian meetings. We tried to get people to come. We were political strategists in those efforts. And every time it got a little closer, until finally, at the 2010 Assembly, the church did repeal that paragraph of the Book of Order, replacing it with a requirement that every candidate for ordination, and this is not just ministers, but elders and deacons as well, be examined individually on the basis of their calling and their gifts. No group will be systematically excluded from ordination. That was approved by the majority of Presbyterians in 2011. 4 years later, the majority of Presbyterians would approve a change to the definition of marriage, which now is defined as a unique commitment between two people, traditionally a man and a woman. There was a compromise made on the floor of General Assembly, but the effect of that change was to open the doors to marriage for all people in the Presbyterian Church. So, you go to the next slide. The point I want to make about sharing this progress is that we need to understand that it's only progress in a certain way. And this is where you come in. It's where every congregation around the country needs to be aware that the discussion about LGBTQ inclusion in the church did not end in 2015, the last time General Assembly voted on marriage. There's way more conversation that still needs to happen. The reality is that a lot of churches never talked about it again after that day. And if you think about other advances in American history or in the church, where groups came to enjoy a deeper sense of inclusion, came to enjoy certain legal protections, it never happened all at once. Changing the law was never enough. People's hearts and minds had to change too, and indeed have not entirely changed, whether we're talking about equity for women or equity for people of color, equity for people with disabilities. And the same is true in the church with regard to LGBTQIA+ people. A lot of churches never took practical steps to enflesh those lofty ideas of inclusion. A lot of churches have never talked about their own commitments to inclusion, never adopted policies that officially allow same-sex marriage, never celebrated LGBTQ people's gifts. They simply went on. Some of them went on because they know that they are still divided, that there's still a range of views in the pews of our churches and in our regional bodies, our presbyteries. There are entire churches that would identify as being less open to the gifts of LGBTQ people serving in leadership roles in their church. There are other churches that proclaim that they are welcoming, but where individual people have had negative experiences? How do we make sure that's not us? How do we make sure that our church really shows forth the gospel in how we welcome all of God's people? And even in the churches that are doing the best job, the ones that call themselves progressive churches, that call themselves welcoming, a lot of them call our office and say, we're doing everything right. I've got gay people on my session. I've got a rainbow flag out front. And no more gay people are coming. Where are they? How do we send out the message to the world that we are a welcoming space? What does it mean to proclaim that vision? It doesn't do a whole lot of good to be inclusive if nobody knows it, right? PCUSA is, of course, not the only denomination that's dealt with these issues. I offer that one because it's the one I know best. But consider it a case study, because I think what we're talking about, and whether you're watching on the live stream, hello to those of you watching on the live stream, or whether you are here from a congregation other than this one, all of this, I think, still applies anytime communities of faith are trying to figure out how best to serve all of God's people. So let's talk then about the impact of welcome. I'll start by telling you a little about the Covenant Network of Presbyterians, the particular organization I serve. And then we'll move past that to kind of broader theological issues that we might want to think about if we're going to actually be intentional about this. So the Covenant Network was founded, as I said, in 1997. This is our current mission statement. We call it a call to covenant community. Churches get involved in our work by affirming, their session affirms this call to covenant community. And what it really is saying is that we as a community of faith are going to be committed to engaging the church, actually not just being inviting, but engaging the church to be inviting. We're going to educate, and we're going to equip. We're going to provide resources so that people, wherever they are and whatever their circumstances, can more faithfully bear witness to God's inclusive love. Our motto, our little tagline from our founding used to be, toward a church as generous and just as God's grace, which is lovely. But it's not really enough. Generosity is important. Justice is important. But it can't just be the label. It can't be just a description. It has to be lived. It has to be truly inclusive justice. So how do you get involved with the Covenant Network? You start by affirming the call to covenant community. We'll go to the next slide. There's other ways that we hope churches will get involved. We want them to expand their welcome. We want them to be intentional, to take practical steps of hospitality and love to send the message that everyone's there. We'll talk about what those might be. We invite congregations to commit to supporting these efforts throughout the church with their prayers, with their financial support, with their engagement at the higher councils of the church. And I know that this congregation has done all of those things. And finally, we hope churches will really tell their story. One of the things I've learned in doing this work over 9 years is that no one ever succeeds at it when they try to do it alone. Your witness is never complete by yourself. We always have to keep reaching out to partners in this work, whether it's the church down the road or churches around the country. Some of what we're currently working on, we're holding covenant conversations. These are events that are hosted in local communities. There was a time when the Covenant Network was famous for its big national conferences. Hundreds of people would come from all over the country to some big church in a big city, mostly clergy, by the way, using their continuing education budgets. And they would hear great speakers and great sermons, and that was really important for a long time in the church. But we realized that that wasn't the pressing need right now. Preachers spending their continuing education budgets. What was really needed was for people in the pews, leaders in local churches, to be talking about these issues. And so we've gone to a whole different model. These covenant conversations, we host them ideally with clusters of local churches or sometimes regional presbyteries. that bring churches together who are in all different stages. There's the church with the rainbow flag out front, and there's the church that just read an article and says, we've never really talked about gay people. We need to do that. And they come together, they learn from each other. We bring in some speakers, we bring in a resource or two, and then we let them begin that work in their place, and we offer to support them in the future. This is really an important ministry that we've been starting just over the last couple of years. The pandemic was not helpful in those programs happening, but we're getting them cranked up again. In fact, in 2 weeks, I'll be in Charlotte, North Carolina, where we're doing our first post-pandemic covenant conversation. Additionally, we've been expanding access to our resources. We have this wealth of things that have been assembled over the last 24 years of the organization. We are trying to catalog them, make them available in digital forms so that more and more churches can still use the ones that are not just about something that happened in 1999, but in fact are helpful to congregations today. We are holding the national church accountable in its relations with churches around the world. One of the realities is that churches around the world are talking about these issues now. Sometimes those are very difficult conversations, and understandably so, because in many countries, LGBTQ people can be put in prison for being gay. They can be persecuted in very significant ways. So the church's witness is really important. How is our church, the PCUSA, in its world mission efforts and in our ecumenical relationships, how are we being intentional in supporting churches around the world as they have these conversations? Our organization is working closely with PCUSA's world mission to shape that conversation. And finally, the thing we do perhaps most of all is the one that's hardest to quantify. I answer the phone. I get calls every week from candidates for ministry, from churches that are trying to call a pastor, from church leaders who are encountering a conflict in their congregation. We offer experience and support and pastoral care that helps the church keep moving forward through an issue that is far from over. And why do we do it? Well, it's a theological issue. It's about welcome. So why do I think that word needs a little fleshing out? Why do we need to bear in mind that it's not just an easy thing to say, all are welcome? It has to do with what we mean by welcome. And for me, it's about fully including people in the life of a community. What do we in our tradition believe about community? What is it we say happens when 2 or 3 come together? Anyone? Yes, God is present. Christ is there with them. We believe that the place that in this day and age you actually encounter God is with other people in the community of faith. In fact, as Presbyterians, we believe that especially about the Lord's table. When we come to the communion table together in church, we believe Christ is present, not on the table, but around it. It's a profoundly significant thing to say someone is part of community. It is to say they have access to God Almighty, because that's where God is. So then what does it mean for us to say that someone is excluded from community? What does it mean to say that someone doesn't have access to those 2 or 3 gathered to that table? Whether it's because they don't feel welcome, whether it's because there are rules that prohibit it, whether it's because they're welcome to come, but they're not going to see their gifts celebrated fully, whether it's because they're going to come, but there's not a restroom that has signage that is appropriate for who they are. Whatever the thing is that's keeping them from that community, it's not just making them feel uncomfortable. In our theology, it's keeping them from God. It's keeping them from the place where they will meet the risen Savior. It's no small thing for someone to be unwelcome, given what we believe. Now, if that's true, then that means that inequity of access to community is a scandal to the gospel. It's the opposite of proclaiming good news. And it also means that if we don't do something about it, if we know it's a problem, and we allow it to continue, well, that's being complicit. That's every bit as sinful as being the perpetrators of the injustice. So, as we move toward a time of conversation, which I hope is a conversation with everyone in the room, but especially our panelists, there's some questions I want us to think about. What do you think keeps churches from engaging on matters of inclusion of LGBTQIA+ people? What are the barriers to conversation? And what do you think keeps people from knowing that they will be welcomed or feeling welcome once they are there? We all know that this is an important idea. Practically speaking, what's the difference between being welcomed and not? And then finally, are there particular challenges that churches have in communicating to welcome? Are there things that are harder for churches than for any other organization or institution in society? Let's see if we can figure that out too. I'm going to invite the panelists to come forward. Thank Bob for putting together this panel. Come down here. Is this on?
Yes.
All right. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Thank you for agreeing to do this. I'm going to introduce each of them by asking them a question. And after each of them gets a chance to answer their question, we'll open up all the questions to all of them, and I would also love to hear if there are questions that you all have. Rochelle Ford is a licensed social worker. She's a member of this congregation. She does counseling and care for people, which is a pretty good place to be. Rochelle, I would love for you to tell us a little bit of your own experience, your own history, having been part of church all your life, but also knowing very well what it is to be welcomed or not.
Okay. Well, I actually didn't grow up in a church home, but in middle school is when I started attending church, and I really thought I was going to be a youth pastor when I grew up. I loved kids and just wanted to work with them. And then when I was in between junior and senior year of high school, that's when I realized that I was not straight, and also when I kind of realized that gay people weren't exactly welcome in the church that I was attending. So I got kind of pushed aside. Like I didn't suffocate who I was as far as my identity goes, my orientation, but my relationship with God definitely suffered for a while. And I did start going back to church when I was in my 20s. However, I never felt like I could be my real, authentic self. I identify as pansexual, which is a little more inclusive, I think, than bisexual. I'm attracted to people regardless of their gender, and I always felt it was a lot easier to be more involved in church when I was dating a man versus when I was with a woman. And I haven't really, like the experiences I've had that have been uncomfortable haven't been overt discrimination. It's been more like churches where I've tried to get involved in a Sunday school or a small group and was asked, so tell me about yourself, do you have a husband? And one time I mentioned, well, no, I have a wife. And they just kind of, oh, okay. And they didn't really hear back from that leader again. And simple things like that where it's more of the, well, yeah, you're welcome as long as we don't really talk about it. And then, but I have had good experiences too. I was very fortunate to find a welcome and accepting church in Chicago, and it was great, mostly because one of the pastors was an openly gay male, and they had people in leadership roles that were LGBTQIA+. And I was involved with the children's ministry there, which was really great. And then when I came here to First Pres, it was pretty welcoming right off the start. And I do appreciate that that we have these hard conversations and are trying to do the best that we can, but also acknowledging that we have a ways to go.
Rochelle, thanks. Let me introduce the Reverend Mark Schweiter. He's a retired United Methodist minister. He's also president of Decatur Pride and also of Pitfalls here in Decatur. Mark, you are part of a denomination that, like the Presbyterians, has struggled around these issues. Yes. You struggled, you were a pastor, so you were faced with how to be a welcoming church in the years you were serving congregations. But you've also been out in the community in a different setting of learning to welcome and affirm and include members of the diverse community. I guess I'm curious what you think makes it so hard for churches to do this well, and what makes the difference with really being able to engage with LGBTQIA+.
I think the LGBTQ plus community, a lot of persons are suspicious of the church because if they grew up in the church, many of them were badly wounded because of how the church taught and condemned who they were and like that, and so many are really wounded, and so are suspicious and reluctant to engage with the church. Some have given up on the church. So that's one of the barriers. I mean, churches can work on being welcoming and everything else, but there's that hurdle to get over. And in my ministry, I never served any churches where I could really develop LGBTQ plus ministries. They were relatively conservative churches around Central Illinois. So that's one of the hurdles, and I think for churches who really want to be in ministry with LGBTQ plus persons, one of the things it's going to take is patience. To try to engage with these persons, give them time to trust, one of the things that churches need to do is commit. And by commit, I mean, there's the old saying, put your money where your mouth is. Make sure there's a line item in the church budget for this kind of ministry. Maybe figure out a way to staff it, either part-time or volunteer. Have a person on the staff in some way who would engage with the community. Go to drag shows. That's where a lot of the community's at, not all of it. And begin to get to know people.
It doesn't seem so crazy when you say it out loud. That's where the community is, so that's where we go. That's what we've always had to do, right? If you want to serve homeless people, you go to where there are homeless people. If you want to serve poor members of the community, you provide services for poor people to be at. I appreciate that. Thank you, Mark. So Bob Wallenberg, pastor here, of course, and Mark said that he served churches that where he didn't really have the opportunity to cultivate explicitly affirming ministries. But here at First Church, this has been a Covenant Network church since before you got here. It's a church that wants to have this witness, and you've been able to live into that in some ways. Can you talk a little bit about the ways that you have tried to foster an inclusive community?
Well, a lot of that work, as we've said, was already done before we came. Jean and I, over the years, we've said, have served churches where this was a more difficult conversation. And we have a lot of experience with that. And we, at a certain point in our old lives, we said, well, before we retire, we'd like to be in a congregation where this conversation has already been going on for a while. And this has been a great congregation for doing that. I think we have tried to be as encouraging as we have tried to be, and inviting people like you to come. Last Lent, our series, we had a series of educational studies around this issue. So trying to keep the issue at the forefront of our discussions, I think, has been important. But it is challenging. You know what really, in your comments right before we came up here, the one that really hit me was talking about friendliness. And we came here from Iowa. I grew up in Iowa, and in Iowa we have a term, Iowa nice. And Iowa nice is when you're in the group, you're nice to each other, and then when you leave, you go talk about the real conversation.
We call that Midwestern nice, where I come from, and that includes all of us.
And I think you could probably say there's such a thing as Presbyterian nice. I've certainly served on enough committee and commissions on ministry where we talk about difficult issues going on in churches, often caused by pastors. And Presbyterians are really reluctant to hold people accountable for bad behavior. And I think in this area, this is an issue in churches. Churches can be very friendly and welcoming, as you were talking about, but some of that can be that kind of Iowa nice kind of friendly and welcoming. And it's really getting down to the nitty-gritty and really putting your money where your mouth is, however you want to say it. That's where it's really tough. And being alongside a congregation that's working at that is, that's challenging work for all of us, I think, because none of us like tension, that feeling of tension and conflict. And I'm certainly a conflict avoider, which is really bad for a pastor to be. But sometimes you have to head into a difficult topic that is going to cause some conflict. And that's hard to know how to do as a church when we have it kind of baked into us. We should be loving and caring and accepting, and we don't want to cause irritation. But unfortunately, the victims of that are often people like LGBTQ people who then are left on the outs because nobody really wants to say anything that might rub someone the wrong way in the church.
Yeah, that's very well said, Bob. I think that conflict aversion is one of the biggest barriers to progress on these issues, because there will be conflict, right? I mean, that's the same motivation that led me not to come out for many years. I didn't want to cause a problem. And so I made decisions that had a cost to me personally, but I would argue even a cost to other LGBTQ people who might have been lifted up by my willing to do a hard thing. And I think when we find ourselves being conflict averse, we want to be peacemakers. That's a biblical principle. But Jesus was a peacemaker without being afraid of conflict. He caused plenty of conflict. The question is who loses? If we avoid the conflict, who is in the prevailing position, the status quo? And if you find that it's the people who have always been in the prevailing position, ones who've always been included, then I would maybe think we should ask whether that's the people Jesus might have instead gone ahead and initiated some conflict for. Anyone want to react to anything that others on the panel have just said? Want to get to some questions from the audience, if we have any, so. Okay. I have other questions, but I'm going to pause and see if anyone here has had any come to mind. Okay, be thinking. I'll keep asking. So, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I have one, but I think it's too big, but I'll say it anyhow.
No question is too big for us to try to answer.
Well, and this is particularly for Rochelle, and that's just how in this church, any suggestions she has to make it more open and more 24/7 open, no matter what the situation, and so on and so forth.
So the question, which was directed especially to Rochelle, is what can we as a church do to make the church more open and make it, as you said, 24/7 open in all circumstances and to all people? Want to give that a shot, Rochelle? In 25 words or less?
I might have to think and get back to that because, like I said, this is one of the more accepting congregations I've been to. I think just maybe reiterating that, hey, you're all welcome here, and just making sure people know that and can believe it. One thing that I think shows that that we would be like the way you can be the most accepting and open congregation is basically, yeah, I'm gay. So what? How can I help you with your spiritual journey? And I think that's probably what a lot of us would want it to just be. That's our characteristic, but that's really not what we're here. We're here to focus on Jesus and just to make sure people, maybe they're reminded of that, because even if we have that rainbow welcome flag post out front, that doesn't always mean anything. I appreciate it, but we just need to have reminders sometimes, especially if we've been hurt in the past from previous church experiences.
I think there's a number of things that congregation can do. I want to first of all just say to you all thank you for including me on this forum. And as I've gotten to know about First Presbyterian, I am deeply impressed with your ministries and your willingness to have ministry with the LGBTQ plus community. I think probably this is the most progressive church in that area in our community. So I applaud you for that. I do think there's a lot of work to be done, and depends how much you want to do that work. One of the things is that I was a co-founder of Macon County Youth Pride, which was a youth group here in the community. I'm not part of that now. But the youth opened my eyes and my mind to a lot of stuff. I thought I knew everything, but no. These days there's so many terms and definitions for incremental small categories of LGBTQ plus. One was mentioned in terms of pansexual. Maybe you've heard of that, maybe not. So educating ourselves in terms of this variety of terms can be helpful. Learning how to address LGBTQ plus persons. Now, if we have a person of color in the church, we know how to address them. We know what names or terms are offensive and what terms are welcome. And the same thing goes for the LGBTQ plus community. I think one of the best things, whenever the congregation can find a way to do it is to just work side by side with LGBTQ plus persons. You know, our Decatur Pride meets here, and I'm hoping in time we can engage the congregation and maybe find projects we can work together. You know, it seems like when we just work together on something, you know, we really get to know a person. And, you know, it just, you know, it develops fellowship. That's an old term, but you know what I mean. I think if there's anything else I can add to this. Actually, one of the resources in our community, if you all ever wanted to do some training on LGBTQ plus issues, is Jessica Smiley at Heritage Behavioral Health. She's done trainings in this. She is phenomenal, and she's always happy to connect with community.
I want to tag on to Mark's words too. I think he's absolutely right. Have conversations, build relationships that give you opportunities to inquire and learn. But at the same time, do the work yourself. Don't expect LGBTQ plus people to do all of the educating, because, as Rochelle said, there's more to her than being pansexual. And she also wants to come here to talk about Jesus and to grow in her faith. And her job here isn't to teach everyone else what the letters in LGBTQ stand for. Does that make sense? So it's it's okay to be curious, and I think most of us are glad when people ask questions of authentic curiosity. But I think we're also glad when people Google it and find and do some research, because as Mark said, it does matter. The words we use matters. Understanding matters.
Yeah, and just speaking on behalf of old straight white males.
Thank you. That's always a voice that we don't get enough of. So
exactly. And I want to speak on the pitfalls of progressive liberal type folks like me. There is, you know, in the progressive community, we're always trying to be sensitive to wherever there are injustices. And of course, there are injustices everywhere. So then sometimes it can feel like this field of landmines. And out of fear, we can be afraid to ask someone a question, or I don't want to say the wrong thing because I know some terms are offensive and some are not, and so I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to be the guy who's saying the wrong thing. And you know, as much as niceness, as I was saying before, can be a barrier, so can fear. And good-hearted people who intend and mean well can feel, you know, I may be the only person like this in the room, but you can, out of fear, you can not do the right thing. And, you know, I think the wisest thing I've heard from some LGBTQ teachers who I've listened to have said, don't be afraid to ask me something. You know, if you don't know what to call my partner, is my partner I don't know about you, Brian, whether you call your partner, husband, whatever. And so I was told, ask, which seems wise advice. But a barrier can be that fear of asking, because I don't want to put my foot in my mouth. I don't want to unintentionally offend. So I think that giving ourselves permission to saying the wrong thing, putting our foot in our mouth, in an attempt to open dialogue and be including of others. It's what you do with all your friends, is you open up your life to them and ask them to open up their lives to you.
and you say you're sorry when you need to, and you move on. And that is okay. We don't have anyone on the panel today representing a transgender or a gender non-binary perspective. That's an area where the church, in this moment, in my experience around the country, has a lot of work to do, and is really trying to do work in a lot of places. As society in general is growing in its understandings around gender identity, so is the church. But it can be challenging, particularly around issues of language, particularly around inclusive terms for people, inclusive terms in worship, including inclusive terms on signage. These are really important questions, though, and as Bob said, I agree. Sometimes the right thing to do is ask, and then abide by people's answers. If people want you to use particular pronouns, because that's how they identify, he, him, her, his, she, her, hers, they, them, theirs, abide by their request. It's basic hospitality to call someone what they want to be called. Other questions? Yeah.
This was a question for you, but it really can be for any of you or all of you, because each of you has a ministry, many ministries. At this point in your journey around this subject, what encourages you, discourages you, and perhaps surprises you?
So the question was, in your ministry of seeking inclusion and justice in the church, what encourages you at this point? What discourages you? And what perhaps surprises you? I'm going to have other people go first so I have time to think about my answer. No, Mark, go ahead.
Well, I'll go first, I guess, since I have the mic. I mean, I'm not trying to brown nose this congregation, but, you know, it was so refreshing and encouraging to come into this congregation, and knowing that it had already included LGBTQ people into church leadership and into other forms of leadership in the church. So clearly, that was way ahead of any other congregation where we had served, and that was just a breath of fresh air for us to be in a community that was already at that place. You know, discouraging is you just read the news every day. You know, I think it's like the racial issues that has been such a rude awakening recently. Feeling like we thought we had made so much progress, and no, really there's so far to go. And I think the same is true around these issues, that there are so many successes, some of which you pointed out, but then you're brought down to reality and realize, oh, there's so much further to go. With all of us, including myself, as I said earlier, the more you learn, the more you see your own blind spots and the growth that you still need to make as an individual.
One of the things that encourages me, and this sounds very strange, United Methodists have not been able to make the progress that Presbyterians have. We have been stuck since about 1976. Can't move off the dime. Probably next spring, we will be having our general conference, and we will be having a great divorce. The church, I'm very sure, will split. One side being those who want to welcome, be inclusive, include LGBTQ persons in ministry, to be able to perform marriages for everybody, which we're prohibited right now. The other side says they're welcoming, but LGBTQ plus folks have to repent of their sin. So that's how that works. I think the split will energize both parts to move ahead and focus their ministry. So I'm really looking forward to that. Of course, one of the things that's discouraging is every year there are transgender persons who are killed. Their lives are taken from them. Mostly transgender women of color, but not exclusive to that. And there's a big number of those every year. We've tried to have a memorial service through PFLAG every year, but COVID has kind of shut that down. We hope to get back to that. So it's really discouraging to see this violence against transgender persons who, just deserve to have a life. I mean, there should not be violence against anybody. So those are just a couple things that come along.
Okay, so what I find encouraging is things like this. Everyone in the audience right now, people who are watching, I find it encouraging that we're having conversations like this, and that it's not just like teenagers and 20-year-olds that are wanting to work to make a difference. I appreciate that it's all ages are wanting to learn how to be more inclusive. And what discourages me is the fact that there's not more safe spaces like this. I'm a part of a couple different online one support things. There's one's a Q Christian network, and another is a progressive Christian Facebook group. And there's, in both of them, people are talking regularly about how they just feel really alone and they don't have support. Thankfully, there are online options for Sunday church services, but as far as local in-person, I just hope to see more inclusion throughout the country and whatnot.
I think the thing I'm most encouraged by are the ministries of out LGBTQ people. It's been 10 years this year since the policy changed and allowed LGBTQ people openly to serve. And many of my colleagues are thriving, and it's so exciting. It's exciting that, in fact, they're free not to thrive. That when the pastors do bad jobs, it's just because they're doing a bad job, not because they're gay. It is becoming, in a lot of places, fairly, I'm going to use this word very cautiously, normal. In the place I serve, in Kansas City, I'm the stated clerk of our Presbyterian and also our synod, the Synod of Mid-America, which right now has a transitional synod executive who is an openly gay married man, and our Presbyterian executive who was just hired is an openly gay married man. So the church has changed in some significant ways, and that's really encouraging to me. What is discouraging to me is the number of places that isn't true 10 years later. I was talking with a group of Presbyterian executives right before the pandemic, and wanted to test with them an assertion that the number of presbyteries that have any openly gay ministers serving churches as pastors was less than half. And they told me in that group, which the people who came to my workshop I think were probably overly progressive. I think they were probably more on that side. And in their presbyteries, only a third of them had openly gay ministers serving as pastors of churches. So they actually thought my number was too high. They think the number is more like a third or less. So that's a lot of the country. Not to mention elders and deacons in churches. Not to mention churches that are performing same-sex marriages. So we have a long way to go. The surprise I want to share, and unfortunately it's a negative surprise, just in the last year, I'm now aware of 3 openly queer pastors who went to churches being open about who they are, who have been more or less had their ministries ended in those churches because the churches said they were inclusive and supportive, but didn't turn out to be so much. One was a lesbian who was married to a woman. One was a bi man who is married to a woman. And one was an openly gay man. They all went to churches that were progressive churches, but found that their living fully in their identity became too much a source of conflict for them to continue in ministry. That it was a surprise and terribly sad. We still have a long way to go.
I have a question for you, Brian.
Yes, Bob.
So since, this is something you do as a full-time job, so you hear a fair amount of struggle. So what spiritual, theological resources do you draw on to be encouraged when it gets difficult to hear these difficult stories?
It's a great question. Sounds like a question from our small group back 20 years ago in ministry. It is a challenge. Certainly the resource that I draw on the most is God's gift of community. I think one of the real challenges facing LGBTQ people in ministry, even if they've gotten through the ordination process and gotten ordained, is that they often serve in a lot of isolation. The job they get is as a solo pastor of a church in a small community, and they're the only gay minister in town and the only gay person in their church. And they don't have community. They don't have people to be processing all of that with. So I'm blessed to have community, to have friends who support me and who have known me through the struggle and continue to be with me. I think there are actually some great resources out there for queer Christians that I actually have pointed a lot of people to. There's a lot of conversation right now about how the church needs to be, and I use this term even though it may be a little confusing, that there needs to be some queering of the church, which is to say, to be in the LGBTQ community is to know what it means to be kind of a fish out of water, to face, to live in places where others don't understand what you're feeling or experiencing. And the church would benefit from allowing itself to be, to see itself more vulnerably, to identify more with those who have experienced oppression or persecution. And there's a lot of good spiritual resources that draw on some of that line of thinking, theology. And it becomes then a source of encouragement, a source of call to ministry. It puts the experience of LGBTQ people not merely as in a place of suffering, but in a place of ministry, in a place of a prophetic word to speak to the rest of the church and the rest of the world. So I find some comfort in that as well. Yeah.
I think my question would be just kind of for you or and the group you belong to. What is being done to address the unique needs of lesbians, especially as they're aging, particularly because it is different because lesbians are women and
So I think you all in the room could hear the question, the comment, but for those on the streaming, the question is about what is the church, what are organizations like ours able to do for lesbians in the LGBTQ lineup. The L has always been there, but a lot of the attention seems to be paid these days more broadly to issues of diverse gender identities. What's your name? Sorry.
Oh, it's Beverly.
Beverly, that says, there's a lot of attention paid to a lot of other groups, and there's also a lot of attention paid to younger generations. But what about those who've been in this journey for a long time, particularly lesbian women? It's a great question, and I think, and I would love for others to answer it as well. One of the realities of the Presbyterian Church specifically is that the pioneers in this movement for inclusion, and I'm talking about not just before I was involved in the movement, like before I was born, the pioneers for LGBT inclusion in the Presbyterian Church, many of them were women. The legendary names, Janie Spar, whose ordination, as well as her willingness to perform same-sex marriages, brought her before the judicial commissions of the church multiple times, is sort of the person we all aspire to be in terms of courage and prophetic witness. And to know her is to love her and to be grateful that she is part of this church and she stuck with us. What are we doing today to provide for those who are experiencing bias intersectionally? It's not just that they're LGBT, it's that they're women who continue to face discrimination in the church, whose pay is routinely less for the same jobs, who have much more difficult times getting a call or getting senior leadership roles. Still, today, and we've been ordaining women for 75 years. And the answer is I don't know. I don't, because I think the church is still really struggling to do more than one thing at a time, and even to do that one thing. Certainly we have to deal with the fact that LGBTQ people of color are faced with what the state clerk of the General Assembly, J. Herbert Nelson, when I first talked to him about this, he said, you understand that it's a second strike against you. If you are both a person of color and part of the queer community, it feels like you have nowhere to turn. Because half the people who are supporting you in your effort for equity don't understand the rest of the group that is causing the inequity. I do think that certainly I know in this, I guess the encouraging word I would offer is that there is a growing number of people who are able to be out and to speak openly of their experience, and a lot of those are, in my experience, lesbian women, some of whom served the church for a while before they were out, and some of whom are still working on that. But it is a place where faithful witness is happening, and I'm hopeful that in the years to come it would continue to improve. It's not a terribly encouraging answer. It's not a very comprehensive answer, but it's not something that we're unaware of or not paying attention to. Does anyone else have an answer to that?
Well, I was thinking about an encouraging word is, I think there is good news to the waning days of the mainline church. And the good news is that our churches are moving more to the cultural sidelines. Before I was a pastor, many years ago, they used to publish Presbyterian pastors' sermons in the local paper. And if the town wanted to do something, among the luminaries in town you would consult would be the pastors of the tall steeple churches like this. Well, those days are gone. And in some ways, we're still trying to hold on to that center of American culture kind of power. But that power is slipping between our fingers, and I think there is a real opportunity there for the church to become, I like the term, decentered, to be taken out of the middle, the power position of things. And as we, as a church, move more into the margins, then the voices of those who are already there at the margins become more important and louder. And I hope and believe that we are moving more into that place. And I think you talked about it a little bit in some of those terms of how we as a church need to embrace those margins more. And I think we're headed in that way. But it's hard to lose that top dog spot when you were once, you held all the reins of power in the community. It's hard to let go of those finally. But we're going to have to let go of those in order to truly embrace the people on the margins.
Can I say one thing real quick?
Sure.
This congregation takes care of elderly lesbians, by the way. That's all.
Excellent. First Presbyterian Church, your church for
I wanted
elderly
to
lesbians.
acknowledge that, but this was an answer for the bigger picture.
Thank you, Ben. I appreciate that.
Again, that's another area that this congregation is leading the way.
Excellent.
Let me see if I understand your concern. If I can boil it down, it's sort of like, what about us lesbians? Is that
Sort of, yeah.
kind of?
Well, in a way, yeah.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
there's a lot of stuff going on out in
Um,
that.
And I may put my foot in my mouth, and I'm speaking out of some ignorance here, just some observations that I have. I think one of the things is to sit down with lesbian women and just say, what are your concerns? What are your needs? That kind of stuff. The other thing is connecting people. I mean, I'm aware of other lesbian women in the community, and I don't know how well they are connected. It would be great if we can do more connecting. The other thing, and this is an observation, for some reason, we have difficulty recruiting lesbian women for our organizations. And I don't know why that is.
You mean Decatur Pride and P-Flag?
Decatur Pride, P-Flag, you name it. So that's something that our organizations need to explore and find out the why of that.
I'm going to add one other thing, and then I think we're moving toward the end of our time. That and this, I hope this comment doesn't seem dismissive of the question, because it's not intended that way at all. Each of the groups within a movement often feels like it isn't getting the attention. Its concerns aren't getting the attention they need, and they're right. There is privilege and bias even within broader movements for justice. There's been a lot of writing recently about the privileged place that white gay men, have tended to have in groups like the Human Rights Campaign and in civil rights organizations for LGBTQ inclusion. What these questions say to me is how important it is for all of us who work for justice to be attentive to the reality that if any part of us is being left behind or not having their rights and their needs and their equity attended to, then that is diminishing the truth of what we're saying about the movement as a whole. So I offer that just to say, when Rochelle identified as pansexual, we don't talk a lot about pansexual equity in the broader movement. We may need to. And most of all, we need to say that when we're talking about diverse gender identities and diverse sexual orientations, we're not going to prioritize some as the real issues and others as somehow less so.
Just a clarification. I was just bringing the issue of elderly lesbians. I don't think we've been, I don't want to say we're picked on or differentiate or anything like that. And then in the answer to why sometimes lesbians aren't as involved, our jobs and 2 and 3 jobs wear us out. That's it. But why do we not? Well, why do younger lesbian women do not? Because then if they have kids, there's just not enough energy for women that are. We are not a male salary and a female salary. We are 2 female salaries at best, and even at the best. I was just doing some calculations the other day. I know 2 people that have what would be considered really good jobs that are 2 women. Oh my God, they make like $50,000 less than their male counterparts. I mean, that's income inequality is the difference between lesbians, and you addressed it when you said that about gay women. I don't want to
No, I appreciate
talk about that, but I don't think, I'm not saying I want a what about us. I'm saying that's an issue for all, and then in addressing why lesbians aren't as involved, we're tired.
And I appreciate that.
We're women and we're tired, girls, right?
And I appreciate your clarification.
Working women weren't involved when they were working. It was the women whose husbands were lawyers, and I mean, this reality of what volunteerism is 2 women are not the best choices unless you want to get the job done, but.
Fair enough. I appreciate that. Thank you for saying so.
Yes, thank you. That's very illuminating. I mean, you talk about lesbian women who are mothers and how that takes a lot of energy. It just light bulb went off for me. I had a ministry for divorced persons, and it was important for us to provide babysitting. And the same thing probably would apply here. So I appreciate your input. Thank you so much.
All right, so I think we are at the end of the time we've said we want to take. If you'd show the last slide for me. I want you to know that even though this time is sort of coming to an end, I hope this is the beginning of conversation. So for those of you who are members of this congregation, I'll be here tomorrow. I'll be preaching in both services and also teaching in adult Sunday school class, so I hope we can connect some more. But even beyond that, if you'd like to get in touch with me, there's my phone numbers. That's my office and my cell phone number, and I would love for you to call my cell phone. It's fine. My email is there as well. I'd love to stay in touch with you. Out on the sheet where you signed in, out on the table where you signed in when you came in, I have added another sign-up sheet that has space for your email address. If you'd like to receive information from the Covenant Network of Presbyterians about what we're working on, it'll also be a good way for you to connect with our website. Please sign up on that sheet, and I'd love to stay in touch that way. Finally, if the ministry of the Covenant Network is something that you'd like to support, I didn't bring any envelopes, but I'd still be glad for your contributions if that's something that you feel called to do. Thanks especially to the Peacemaking Committee for inviting me this weekend, and thanks to Jean and Bob for this invitation. Thanks to Rochelle and Bob and Mark for being part of this panel. Give them a little round of applause. Well, thanks, Bob. Thank you all for coming. Am I sending them away, or do you want to say another word?
I'd love to close in prayer. That would be great. Okay, let's bow in prayer. Lord, we are so thankful for this community of people here, not only in this room, but joining us via live stream, and those who are not able to be with us here. We thank you for all those persons of care and compassion who reach out to those who especially need to feel the touch of community. And we pray that this discussion here joins with many discussions everywhere to increase our awareness of the needs of our neighbors and to bring us closer to each other and to you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.